Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us as we celebrate a magnificent milestone for OCAD University. It's the 10th anniversary of the Sharp Center for Design. This building has become an iconic symbol for Toronto, and it epitomizes the imagination and dynamism of OCAD University and its students. We're very honored to welcome back to our institution the renowned British architect Will Alsop, who created this building through an amazing collaborative process, and you'll hear a little bit about that tonight. Welcome, Will. He's on the sidelines, but he'll be in front of you in a minute. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of the now deceased Greg Woods, who was the lead project architect on this building, and we very much wish that Greg could be with us tonight, and we think of him. Will, we will always think of this building as one of your greatest accomplishments. There are many more, we know that, and we're very excited that you're creating a new subway station at Keele and Finch Street West. It's great to see you working in our city. And Will runs a firm in the United Kingdom and has an international practice that is guided by the principle that architecture is both a vehicle and symbol of social change and renewal. Will is an internationally recognized painter represented in Toronto by Olga Corporate Gallery, whose art informs the playful flavor of his buildings. Will's design for our institution looked into a future where design is interdisciplinary and highly collaborative. It anticipated our strong focus on design for humanity. Will was correct. The building has become a magnet for students, faculty, and the larger Toronto community, as well as supporting new approaches to curriculum. Will has created master plans and regeneration projects in Rotterdam, Berlin, Manchester, Middlesbrough, and Barnsley, England, for which he won the Architects' Journal Award. Yet it is his irreverent creations, such as the Glenwood Power Plant in Yonkers, New York, and the Sharp Center for Design that sets him apart as a visionary in the field of architecture. Also joining us tonight is Christopher Hume, the architecture critic and urban issues columnist for the Toronto Star. In his writing, Christopher has put the spotlight on the value and importance of architecture in our city and on our daily lives. When the Sharp Center was taking form, some critics and members of the public and politicians treated it with derision. However, Christopher named the Sharp Center for Design one of the, quote, 5 most influential buildings in Toronto, unquote. He was a proponent who saw the practical value of a design that allowed us to keep the school operating during construction, sustain the sight lines of nearby residents to Grange Park, some of whom are actually with us tonight, welcome, and opened a space for public square contiguous with the Grange Park. He applauded the building as a symbol of experimentation and play, unquote, and has been a vocal supporter of the value of innovation. So it is with great pleasure that I hand the stage to Christopher Hume, who will moderate the evening, and to Will Alsop. Please welcome both of them. Have fun.
There's only one bottle of wine here. The real reason that I was so supportive of I've always thought it was the Sharp Pavilion. For 10 years, I've been calling it the wrong name. I apologize. But I like the name of the Sharp Pavilion. I don't know what Will thinks. The real reason that I was so supportive was because I needed something to write about. And there's so little in this city. So as Sarah said, I've been an observer from the beginning. Will and I first spoke in 2000, is that right? No. Yes, yeah. Yes, 2000. And let me just also explain that we thought that what we would do is forego the official lecture, and we're going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So we won't have to be here all night long, and if there's anything that I don't cover, then you can. So, as I said, I remember coming here in 2000 and meeting Will Alsop for the first time, and being impressed, I think, as much as anything, because there was no design then, but about how he talked about the new building as a part of the city. And this seems fairly obvious, but there's so few architects, even now, but especially then, who actually seem to see that their work was part of a context. And so I had enormous interest in what this man was going to do. He was also, I remember, very unimpressed with the streetscape, with the conditions of the sidewalks, pragmatic things like that. And I guess we should start off by talking about how you got the job. I don't know, I don't think it was something that you had sort of thought about much, and I know Greg played a role in that too. And suddenly, it changed your life as much as you changed the life of the city.
That's true. Greg Woods, who later played an important role on this project, I didn't know at all. But he did know someone that was a senior person in my office in London, and they'd been at school together. And he called Jonathan and said, there is this opportunity in Toronto for something to do with the School of Art, and we should just put our names forward for it.
Had you been to Toronto?
I'd never been to Toronto. I thought it was a complete waste of time, I had to say. And I thought, you know, why would we do this? And I said to Jonathan, I said, what do we have to do? I hope it's not a competition. Well, no, we just have to submit our credentials. And then...
and what were your credentials in 2000?
Marvelous.
Had you won the Sterling Award at that point, the Sterling Prize?
No, at the time of the interview, it was a two-stage process. You submitted your credentials, and then there was a shortlist, and then you came for an interview, which I did come for an interview. I can remember when Jonathan came to my desk and said, hey, we've got an interview. I thought, oh, shit. Well, so I took a philosophical approach, and I said, okay, let's go to Toronto on the Friday. The interview was on the Monday. We'll explore Toronto. We'll do the interview, fly back to London, and we won't get the job, but at least we can tick Toronto off my list. And so that's exactly what we did. We went to a very bad restaurant, I remember, and which put me off Toronto a lot. and did the interview. And I got back to London on Tuesday, and they rang me on Tuesday afternoon and said, you've got the job.
Wow.
And I thought, oh shit, again, I've got to go back. And it was actually on the Saturday of that same week I won the Sterling Prize, so I hadn't got the Sterling Prize at that time. So good week, actually, good week.
I was going to say it was a big week for you.
It was fantastic. I got another award that week as well, but I can't remember what it was.
The Sterling Prize was the big one.
It had money attached.
That's always important. So, Will, you came and you talked. I mean, you had been in Toronto for a grand total of 48 hours. What did you tell them? They obviously liked what they heard.
Well, the interview was interesting. What I do remember, there was a very comprehensive brief for this building. I mean, far too comprehensive to be interesting. Not aspirational at all. There was a performance specification for every room. I thought, well, how did they arrive at this? You know, somebody must have designed this building, written a description of what they designed, and then put it out as a brief. And it was so impenetrable, it was impossible. So you couldn't see the wood for the trees, literally. And I was... So, but you do the thing, you know, well, I know that some of the other architects that were being interviewed do what architects do. They came with models and say, look, isn't this marvelous? It's like, you know, it's like bringing sort of, how can I put it, beads and bars of gold and things to the natives. I didn't do that.
We've already bought all the land from
Sure, you've done that already. And
do you think the fact that you had nothing at stake here, that this was not a city that was important to you, the project wasn't important to you at that point, did that kind of give you a freedom?
well, of course, no, having come here, I'd like to win the project, that's for sure. And I remember there was a whole big thing about how there wasn't enough storage, and the big photographs of lockers, and you think, well, why do you need lockers? Sounds like a school. I suppose it is a school. And in a way, I did read the brief on the plane on the way before I fell. It helped me fall asleep. And so I had read the brief, sort of. And I remember at the interview, I got fed up with my own presentation, the usual thing that architects do, so I've done this and I've done that and blah, 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 blah. And you think, oh, this is really boring. But so I asked if I could talk about the brief. And there were 16 or 17 people in the room. I did ask how many people had read the brief, and really only one hand went up. I guess that was the guy that wrote it. And then the next question is, does anyone believe in this brief? And only one hand went up, which is the guy that wrote it. And I thought, okay, so I tore up the brief and said, look, this project is about other things.
So what are those other things? I mean, this is an art college, not a hospital, not a condo.
Well, the brief was written as though it was a hospital, and it was terrible. It was mind stultifying, I have to say. So what I knew was that we had to build, or whoever was to win the project, I didn't know I'd won it at that time, it had to be ready in quite a short period of time in order to accommodate a double cohort. How that came into being, I don't really know.
It's a long story.
And not one that we need to go into, but that was the facts, and it had to be there. Otherwise, this institution would be in trouble. And so I said, and part of that is getting permission to build the bloody building. I mean, that's quite fundamental.
After they'd seen what it was.
Yeah, well, no one knew what it was at the time, and so I said, what I was really interested in is what the students thought, what the staff thought, and most importantly, as it turned out, and something I believed in, is what the people who lived around the park, what they thought.
And why is that? A lot of people would be quite happy to ignore them.
Well, I quite like people. No, I do. I think they're really interesting. But on the other hand, I knew that they were a difficult lot of people. I'm looking at you, Max. And that they had actually successfully held up the AGO on their alterations to their building. And that was the only bit of research I'd done. I knew that they were difficult, but that's not why I wanted to talk to them. I'm interested to talk to the people who had some influence on the project because they lived here, and that I find interesting.
Uh-huh. And does an art college have a license? Is it an opportunity to do something more than provide classrooms and bathrooms and storage, that sort of thing? I mean, is it part of the brief? Even if it wasn't explicit?
As an art school, all I knew, having been an art student myself and having taught at art school, it should be a rough, tough building and not too precious so that students could feel at ease to do anything they like, In spite of super janitors and all those people that they have here to stop you doing what you'd like to do, at least our role as architects was to do something which was approachable. So if you wanted to throw a bucket of paint, you could. I still don't know whether a bucket of paint has ever been thrown in this institution, but I rather hope it has.
There's probably somebody here who has the answer to that question. It has been? We can get to that. So the big question, I guess, that everybody wants to know, that I remember everybody wondering at the time was, why is this building on legs? And people saw it as very kind of fanciful and sort of self-consciously bizarre, but it actually had a number of practical aspects to it.
Well, a number of things that having successfully procured the project, I suppose, and then started this series of workshops, it became apparent that there were an awful lot of people that didn't think there should be a building on the south parking lot.
Why?
Well, because that
Because they
was...
wanted to park their car there?
No, that was a link between McCall and the park.
Ah.
And I thought, well, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a very valid point, and I listened to that. Then you ask, well, where would you put the building? They said, well, you could put it on the roof of the existing building. You said, you could. And then there were people who lived sort of at a certain level in the Grange, opposite. And they said, yeah, that would spoil our view of the park, those that were high enough to see the park. So at that point, that was easy. We'll just raise it so the bottom of the proposed building is at the roof level of the condominiums opposite. Could do that. And that seemed to be okay.
So that's what it was about, accommodating the view of the people across the road.
I didn't know I was going to do this flying box on legs. Okay, I really didn't. But it seemed to be the right thing to do. I mean, I started off by thinking of a tower. And I think some of this wallpaper behind us shows some of those earlier thoughts. But those thoughts were independent and preceded the work with the local community and the staff here and everything else.
I remember at the time you talked about the idea of dragging Grange Park through to McCall Street. That was a nice idea, the one that could have worked, except for that there's that awkward strip of land, which of course is not the architect's problem. If there's anybody here from the AGO, you'll know what I'm talking about.
If there is anyone from the AGO, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Thank you, Will.
No, I was there at meetings with them, saying we can take it away, we don't need that parking, and yet that chicken wire fencing is still there. And that's 10 years later. It should not be there.
It's going to go, apparently, which it should go.
Good. Can you all make sure that that happens? And if it doesn't happen in the next 3 months, just go out with your wire clippers and cut it down, for heaven's sake.
You know, one of the interesting things at the time also, Will, was the construction of the Sharp Center and the placing of the legs, the supports into the ground, which I think had to be within an eighth of a centimeter or something tiny like that. And I remember that McCall Street would be lined with people south of Dundas all the way down practically to Queen, watching this thing happen. It was really an amazing event. It became theatrical.
I do like the idea, and I hadn't thought about it before, that the construction process can become theatre in a way. And I think that's quite important because normally the construction process is just a pain that we just have to sit through. And I'm sure there were painful bits of this project, particularly to the locals, but on the other hand, it was kind of interesting, to see it changing. And certainly, I think it was Max took lots of photographs of these things happening and made a sort of an animated product of all the photographs of this thing under construction, which I thank him very much for.
So tell us a little bit about the actual columns. They were made, if I remember, in Germany or something, and then shipped to Hamilton.
No, they were made much closer than that. They were made at Hamilton.
Hamilton. Oh, I thought they were shipped there.
You got those steelworks just round the corner here, and I remember very well when the legs were under construction with the tapered ends. I mean, they're basically oil pipes, and with tapered ends. And Greg, God bless him, went to look at them, and this was when they were still rusted, and they were all lying down there. There's a certain time, Iraq comes to mind, and he sent me a photograph of these with a caption that said, "Weapons of mass construction." That was good.
So they were assembled or milled, or whatever the term is, in Hamilton, brought here by these enormous trucks. But I mean, once they were in, then basically the hard part was over.
Well, yes, in a word.
No, but this is what I want you to explain. I mean, the idea was, if you recall, that grade 13 had been eliminated. So suddenly there were going to be 2 years coming into the school in one. And the idea, the brilliance of this scheme was that you could do it once you had the legs in the ground and you formed the box on the top. Then it was done. You didn't have to close the school for the next year, which is what happened in other institutions. The people who live in Village by the Grange kept their view. The park was going to be dragged from Grange through to McCall Street. It accomplished a number of very practical purposes. And I think that my memory at the time, Will, is that people were caught up in this kind of feeling that this was sort of science fiction, archigram, things plodding forward and all that sort of stuff. And in actual fact, it was a response to a series of very mundane demands that you had to meet.
Well, it was a process, I like to think it's a process of discovery.
Okay.
And it became what it had to be. And it seemed obvious at the time, even though people never believed. Well, the further you live away from Toronto, the more they disbelieve what I say, to be honest. And they think, well, that's just Will being willful. No, it wasn't Will being willful. It was Will being attentive to what I was hearing, and then trying to do the best and respond to that. And of course, that's the way projects should be. They're evolutionary projects. You didn't get it right with the first thought. You pay attention, you listen, and then something happens.
Did the neighbors play a role in the evolution of the legs?
Well, not with the legs as such. I mean, clearly, having established that you...
enthusiasm for it
Were they enthusiastic? I do remember that conversation. There was generally an enthusiasm for bringing or trying to drag the park, in spite of the AGO, through to McCall, and that was overriding, and then trying to protect the views from the village on the Grange, which I totally respected, and therefore it just emerged. I don't remember those particular moments. I don't quite remember. I just remember that what I had taken to be a fairly hostile group of people who lived around the park became less hostile. In fact, I rather liked them. I liked them better than some people in OCAD at the time, and I think that was fine. Because, remember, alongside all this, there's always the question is, can you afford it? And there are people who I've always hated, really, project managers who know everything but actually know nothing, and who then start to attack the budget. And whatever you did to try and bring it into budget, the cost never came down.
Are you talking about value engineers and that sort of thing?
No, it's not value engineering. That's a misnomer.
Okay.
It is actually doing people out of stuff which might be quite good. And
did you have to endure much of that here?
Sure.
Yeah.
Of course. We're in Canada. It's closer to USA, which is the worst.
Can you be a little bit more explicit about that? The worst.
Well,
in terms of giving architects the freedom to.
I do have to say that I am sort of European, and in Europe we have things called cost engineers who know what they're talking about, and you work with them, and you work with them until you get it to the point where you can announce it to a client or indeed anyone else. Here, the project manager knew nothing about cost. And it was only down to my good friend, and who I have great admiration for, because clearly the structure was a very important part of this building. And Chris Andrews, who was the engineer, who's sitting over there tonight, and I must like him because I had breakfast with him this morning. And we hadn't slept together, but
It's good to know.
yeah, I just want to be clear on that. But he was brilliant because there was one very important question at one of these sort of critical meetings, I'd put it, where the project manager was asked how it arrived at this price, which is considerably over budget, I had to say. And Chris said, and what weight of steel, which is an important question, have you allowed for the, and he said, that was something like, I can't remember the exact figure, but that's 3 times as much steel as you need. If you get the right amount of steel, then that brought the thing more or less into budget. That was good, wasn't it? And I've loved Chris in the proper sense of the word ever since, because that was a critical moment in the evolution of this project. This project could have gone nowhere. We could have ended up with a 4-story building on the south parking lot, and it would have been dull.
And once all the discussion about the tolerances of the piers and the weight of the steel, et cetera, and you'd lost the nap rooms. That's what I remember. There were going to be 2 of them, if I recall. And I went back to the Star after that and said, you know what we need here? We need some rooms where we can have a nap in the afternoon. It went nowhere, but I thought, what a great idea. But I forgot where I was going with all this. But, I know. All those things happened. They were dealt with. And the public perception had nothing to do with any of that, only that there was this outrageous structure there. And, you know, I get lots of emails from readers, and I recall that of all the buildings I've ever written about, this one got the most vicious response, and especially from other architects. And I remember one who, it was a teacher, an architecture teacher, someone said, this is a bad first-year project. I would have failed it. And I thought, wow.
That's why they're teaching.
Yeah. But but why do you think? Why was it there? Why were architects so upset by it? Do you think?
Well, architects do get upset very easily. You know, I regret to say, and they are some of the most difficult people when it comes to architecture. I find out some of the nicest people when you're not talking about architecture. You know, and they buy you a drink and things like that. But I don't know why that is. You know, I mean, there is a whole, and it's the same. You know, almost concurrent with the term or with the time. I don't know, sometime in the mid-70s, where there were no rules about architecture. You could do whatever you like. That became very clear. Then who are the people that started to try and invent rules? Architects. Why would they do that?
But you cite as some of your heroes, your architectural heroes, as people like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier.
Yeah, but you know they wouldn't exist today. They were great when they existed.
You mean that we had to go through them in order to get to
Somewhere else. I believe that.
So they were a necessary evil?
No, they were necessarily great architects, but they responded to the conditions at the time. They were, but of course, since they ceased practicing, you know, technology, everything's changed, and socially, structurally, technologically, everything has changed. You can do, and theoretically, you can do whatever you like. I'm a great supporter of that and believer of that, because then you can remain open. You don't have to succumb to any particular architectural philosophy or set of rules, in my view.
And if somebody were to ask you, what's yours, what would you say? You come out of a modernist tradition, but you have taken it a few steps further. Technology allows you to do more than they could do. I wonder if that's actually true, though, Will. I mean, this building here, is the technology so sophisticated in this building that it couldn't have been done even 100 years ago? Is technology the issue?
It helped, but I mean, it's not such a technologically sophisticated building that, as I said at the beginning, it's a robust building, and I think that was important for the sake of the students as much as anything else. But I've quite lost my way. It's something to do with age. That's what I wanted to say. And you know, as you get older, you really don't give a damn. In a good way. And I think that's very important. And I still teach, particularly in Vienna, quite a lot. And you know, some of the most conservative people are the youngest students. Bizarre. I encourage it, of course.
You see, I think what you did for Toronto, and the reason why this building is important, is because, and perhaps a Toronto architect couldn't have done it, but for whatever reason, you managed to talk this city through this school, through the neighbors and everybody else involved. You managed to talk them into doing this, to taking this risk. Of course, it turned out not to be such a terrible risk after all. In fact, it was actually kind of good in many respects. So I wonder, you know, when all is said and done, you know, the real contribution that Will Alsop has made is just to help us get over ourselves.
Don't encourage me on that. I mean, I would like to say that this building, I'm very proud of this building, and I think it's worked very well on behalf of lots of different people, and including the neighbors. But I do find it also embarrassing at the same time, insofar that wherever I go to a lot of places in the world, and they all know this building. They might know nothing else I've done, but they know this building. And I thought, that's quite kind of interesting. But I was very proud. I think it was, what was the mayor called? David
Miller?
Miller. He told me that this building had increased tourism in downtown Toronto by a certain percentage. I thought that's good. But more important is, I think within 12 months, it increased the number of people that students who wanted to study here by a huge percentage. And therefore, that sort of reminded me that there is a relationship between the ambience, the excitement, everything else of a building and what it does. And fundamentally, this is a school of art and design, which I love, because I was brought up in those sort of institutions. And in my mind, the best ones are the ones that actually weren't designed very much. There's St. Martin's. I went to Northampton School of Art. Hey, that was designed as an art school.
Well, you know, then you've got the Charles Rennie Mackintosh Glasgow School of Art, I mean, which I guess the idea there is that it's so beautiful, such a remarkable piece that it inspires the students. I don't know. I mean, it would seem to me that what your building tells students is that art is about experimentation, and that it's okay to experiment, to take risks, ultimately to fail. Not that the building is a failure, because I don't think it is, but I think it does make that statement very clearly.
I think you talk about the Mackintosh School, and I only went there 3 or 4 times before they had that tragic fire last year. But it seemed to me what Charles Rennie Mackintosh had done, I like to think it was deliberate. He made very large landings on the staircases. And what I observed for myself is that's where students actually sat or stood and talked, because there was space. And it seems to me that dialogue, you know, it's not about the classrooms. You know? I mean, if I had any criticism of this building, there are too many rooms in it. You know? I always thought that, you know, the classroom, what's that? Something to do with being 16 years old. You know? However, that's my gripe. But I thought that he did understand that at Glasgow. And it's about those incidental spaces where people might have a chat. In those days, have a smoke. Sadly gone.
Maybe the windowsills do that now.
Well, yeah, I was going to come back to that. You know, the spaces to nap are the windowsills here, because they're very deep. And I'm pleased to say that I have been back to the school a number of times and seen students sleeping on the windowsills, and great.
You're sure they're students, though?
Well, Sarah was there, I noticed, but anyway.
They've been posed. Will, when you were just telling us that wherever you go, this is the one building everybody knows, and you said that you were embarrassed about that?
Well, only because, you know, sometimes I still go around the world sort of like pitching to get interesting work sometimes. And I put this up because then knowing it will surprise them. Oh, we know that. Yeah, okay.
Oh, I see.
Seen it before.
Does it help you get other work?
Sometimes. Well, I like to think it does.
I mean, do people say, we want a sharp pavilion in our city?
No one's ever said that to me.
No.
But they know that we do it. But see, what I'm fascinated in I did this building, which I think, by and large, I don't want to pat myself on the back. I think it's pretty good for the school, And it's been quite good for Toronto, and I think it engaged some sort of debate which is extended, and a lot of things have happened in Toronto since, which I think might not have happened. I like to think this, if this building wasn't here. It's only 10 years, for heaven's sake, but you know. Nonetheless, I think it's contributed to some architectural debate within the city. But no one's ever asked me to do it again here. And okay, why should they? And I don't really care about that. But actually, as you get older, in 10 years you do get older, funny enough. You do look older since I first saw you.
Well, I am older. So do you, Will.
But yeah, so do I, yeah, it's true. And fatter, you know.
I wasn't going to say it.
No, but you...
But Will...
Someone said, you know, all your friends should be poorer, fatter, and uglier than you. But anyway, that's something else. But nonetheless...
I'm going to change the subject immediately. Since OCAD, you have done other things in the city. You actually opened an office here at one point. You've done the 2 subway stations, which I guess are going to open sometime this century. And then there's the
They're well under construction, okay?
So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, this is a kind of a polar opposite sort of project, isn't it? Or to go from an art college to a subway station?
Well, they're both public projects in one way or another. And I think in that way, that's good. And basically, as an architect, public projects are the best projects you can get.
And why?
Because you're spending you're not spending anyone's personal money. I quite like that. Okay, there's still budgets are always an issue and everything else, but they don't feel personally responsible for those budgets. And therefore, you can have a much more open conversation about what it is you're trying to do and how you might achieve those budgets. You know, if I design you a house, it's your money, and you get very worried about it. So when it comes to, well, I mean, there are one, two, I don't gripe about the city, because I love the city, and I love coming here. But generally speaking, in the private sector, say on condominiums, which there are an awful lot in the city, you don't pay your architects enough. They can't behave properly.
Just clap out loud there.
We're 20 late. And I think that's scandalous. You know? So you can't blame the architects because they're not paid enough to spend sufficient time to investigate what could be done. Which is, say, coming back to OCAD, you know, there was little time, but there was time to explore things, go down a couple of blind alleys, and then open it up, and then actually try and make it work within the budget. Mm-hmm. Most of the private investors or developers, whatever you like to call them, they know too much. They know too much for their own good. Therefore, they think they know what everything costs without testing it at all. And that's why you end up with some very cheap, nasty, horrible buildings.
But
which you do.
We pride ourselves, I think, in Toronto that we have reached a state of maturity, that we have Daniel Liebeskind designing a condo down at Yonge and the Esplanade. We have you designing a condo up at Yonge and Glengowan, whatever it is.
Strathgowan.
Strathgowan, sorry. And that these places come with a certain cachet because they are designed by architects whose names we know, whose work we respect. Couldn't that be legitimately be a part of a market approach to architecture? And if I look back at all the great bank towers, I mean, there was a time when architecture mattered to banks and to insurance companies, not just to the institutions. I mean, this was how they told us who they were.
You talk about Danny, and I think the project is good. I don't know how it went for him with building permits. I can say up in where I am,
North Toronto?
it's a nightmare. You know, a complete nightmare. It reminds me of a sort of the worst side of democracy gone wrong. Or it's like rich communists. It's the same thing, and it doesn't work, you know. And therefore, the planners become scared, and therefore they're talking about things which they shouldn't be talking about. And well, we'll get there. But it's like pulling teeth. In the time of that condo project, before when I started it, and today, I have to say in London, I have 3 rather larger, more challenging projects in London, which I got permission for within that time. It's amazing. There is something fundamentally wrong in certain parts of this city about getting permission. It's too complicated, too lengthy, too many lawyers involved. You know, why do you need a bloody lawyer? We never use a lawyer anywhere else in the world. Just here. They're expensive, and it comes off the architect's fee too, which is completely wrong. You know, it's stupid.
You know, this is an important point that Will is making. I mean, the de facto planners in the city of Toronto are the lawyers. People think that's normal. People think it's like that everywhere, but it really isn't. I hear that over and over again. But Will, when you think of
But it's the politicians' fault. You know, they create the condition which allows clients to think that they need a lawyer, and therefore they use legal means in order to try and get the permission, because
Well,
it's
you
just
know,
a negotiation.
there's
Nothing to do with aesthetics, beauty,
No.
architecture, or nothing.
No. But you know, there's this Ontario Municipal Board. You remember that?
I do.
And I mean, that kind of, the specter of the OMB hovers over everything. But we needn't worry about that.
No, don't let's worry about that.
We'll worry about that later at the condo up in Strathgown. But when you think of this building, you know, in the trajectory of Will Alsop's oeuvre here, I mean, there was the Peckham Library, there was this one, the building in Rotterdam. Where does this fit into your architecture?
OCAD, you mean?
Yes, sorry, OCAD, yes.
Oh, no, OCAD's up there. It's probably the most enjoyable project I ever did. Partly because of what it deals with, which is our education, partly because of the way it came out, partly because of I think we did this project properly. It was the right process to negotiate, share, to explore what was possible. I love that.
And you are an artist and an architect. Is that a good thing? Is that a healthy thing? Should architects be artists? You know, Jane Jacobs is always reminding people that a city is not a work of art.
I think she was wrong.
You think she was wrong?
I do think city is a work of art. And I do think there are many artists out there that believe that their art is something to do with urbanism and the way we live, and that's the way it should be. To me, there's no separation between what they're thinking and what I'm thinking, and there's no boundaries. And to me, this institution, in part, a lot of the work that goes on here is about breaking down those boundaries and exploring new directions and new ways that things can come into being. And it's very old-fashioned to think that, you know, that's an architect, that's a printmaker, that's a sculptor, that's a painter. You know, to me, it's all the same thing. Or a musician, and all sorts of things. We benefit from much closer proximity, I think.
Shall we see if there are any questions from the audience? At this point, I'm not sure exactly what time it is.
It's,
but
we have 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Does somebody want to? I see a hand over here. Oh, hang on a sec. Just.
You have to wait for the. I think you have to wait. You do, and you have to say who you are.
Hang on a sec. You'll be next.
Great. Hello. My name's Dale Henderson. After 10 years in seeing the building, are there any things that you would do different?
I'd have less walls, but apart from that.
But wasn't that part of the curriculum?
Yeah, I know, but you know,
I mean,
that was my biggest problem when I read that brief on the plane on the way here, and I realized that actually this institution at that time, I think it's changed now, was like a sixth form college. So people didn't actually leave school, they continued to be at school. And I think that's not right. They are adult people. They take some responsibility for what they do. And I don't think it's about cramming every day with courses, with set hours. I think you have more responsibility than that.
But everything else you would leave the same.
You could never say that, of course, but I'm pretty pleased with what's here. And I also know that every wall upstairs could be taken out.
Have you sat in any of these chairs in this auditorium?
Shut up.
Thank you.
Okay, I was going to ask that question, but I'll ask you a variation on it instead, if I may. Now, I understand that you had done several buildings previously on stilts, if I remember reading. So did people criticize you and say you were repeating yourself because you had done previous buildings on stilts? If so, how did you respond to that? And did you ever really consider doing a building here that was not on stilts? So that's a variation of the previous question.
Well, I have to say that this building here, I don't know whether everyone heard your question because you didn't seem to be switched on, but it was about stilts. And would I do everything on stilts? But I want to say that this building was the first building I did on stilts.
Well, you did others,
No, I didn't.
Well, the Peckham Library has a couple of columns in the front that hold up the cantilevered section, but it's not a building on stilts.
But I've become,
in the same way that this is.
yeah, I've become more extreme since then. I think it's the right way to go. What really interested me about this building, which only came after, was thinking you can build a building over an existing building. Now, the existing building is not a great building, but it's there, and people love it or hate it or whatever. It's part of people's history, it's part of their narrative, part of their growing up for some people. And I have to say, in the last couple of years, I've been writing quite a lot about, under a sort of general thesis of don't knock anything down. And to me, from an urban point of view, to actually build over the top or to put things on the side of, to extend buildings or to build underneath or whatever, is quite an interesting way of looking at the evolution of the city. And I'm interested in that. So as a result of that, I have now 4 projects on stilts built over the top of existing buildings. But I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't done this building. But I like to leave that sort of trace of history there because I think it's interesting. You know, because in a way, buildings, however beautiful or however ugly they are, they're a part of someone's history, usually the neighborhood. And I've learned this, that I lived in some really ugly places, particularly when I was a student. And you can live in this place, and after 6 months, what appears to be ugly when you first go there becomes really interesting. It's like sort of familiarity breeds content. There's nothing wrong with that. And therefore, let's leave that. Let's actually manipulate the place. And I go to Vienna a lot, and it's a World Heritage Site, which is, I never understood World Heritage Sites because it seems to me that it's all controlled by people who are not elected. Some are sitting in Paris having marvelous meals all the time. But that's another question. I'm not sure they have the rights, and it stultifies certain places. Prague is one, Vienna is another. But on the other hand, the Viennese get their own back. They do all this weird stuff on roofs in the center. And so I spend my time in Vienna looking up at the rooftops because it's actually more interesting than all that historical stuff down below. Not that I object to the historical stuff either, because it is also beautiful.
Shall we have another question? There's over here.
Speaking of roofs, I think of the real estate at the top of the Sharp Center for Design as prime real estate in Toronto, and I think there was originally some kind of design for rooftop something or other, garden, pavilions, space for students or staff or something. Could you speak a little bit about that and whether there's any possibility that one could ever actualize that?
Well, there's a lot of crap on the roof of this building, I have to say. Certainly it was an ambition that people should go up and enjoy that roof level and enjoy the marvelous summers that you have here in Toronto. It didn't happen for all sorts of reasons. And there are, you know, if you go back to Peckham Library, which Christopher mentioned earlier, I regret that I never put a cafe in that building. But it was difficult to do it at the time. In retrospect, you know, there's all sorts of things you could add or change, and one would do. It would be good to be on the roof here, for sure. Just to get away from the students.
There's a man here in a hat.
I was here from the beginning, from your first lecture, and do you think you woke up the Rip Van Winkle Toronto with your dynamic, innovative structure? Because we even had some brandy afterwards at the opening. And
Did
I
I?
read the wonderful articles that were upstairs by Chris and the American architectural critic. He says, finally, Toronto has a contemporary structure that the world can admire.
I think that was Paul Goldberger in the New Yorker. Well, if they say it's good, it must be. Don't you think?
I agree with that. No, I do think that my wife, she came here long before I did, when she was a student, before I ever met her. And she remembers City Hall as being an interesting contemporary building from that visit. She never came back, funny enough. And when I first came here, I went to look at the City Hall, of course, and it is a fine building. And at that time, and I'm talking about the year 2000, apart from Mies van der Rohe, I'm sure there are other things, but because it was a lightning visit, I didn't see much else. I do think that in the now 14 or 15 years I've been coming here on a pretty regular basis, there are more interesting buildings than there were. So if I was coming here for the first time in 2015, I'd feel very differently about the city. And the food's got better. Which is not facetious. I think
I heard your first lecture here when you showed your subway in London. And I said, if this man gets this contract, it's going to wake up the city.
I hope it did.
Very definitely did.
I think there was a man up there in a red toque.
I just wanted to know how the stilts were transported through the city from the ship, I guess, that they were imported on.
How the columns were transported through the city, because they're 9-10 stories high.
Truck.
But as I recall, these trucks had a driver in the front and somebody at the back, because they were so long. And I mean, they stopped off at the corner. The police stopped every corner. I mean, it was quite a production number to see this thing show up and then get unloaded.
There's a relationship between some buildings and some cities. If you take the Centre Pompidou, if that part of Paris wasn't built on a gridiron system and the Seine wasn't where it was, they could never have built that building in the form that it is. Because they had very long, I can't remember how long the beams were, but they were very long, made in one piece, and they were transported from Krupp in Germany through the waterways, and they could only go in a straight line from the river to the site. And I think that's interesting, because I've come across that in some other places, much more difficult places than Toronto, where there are certain things you can't do because of the city. Therefore, you have to come up with another way.
So the city determined the height of the stilts?
No, that's not true. No, it didn't. I'm just making a more general point there.
There's a man over here.
Will Scott Dudgeon. I was interested in your notion of the city as a work of art, And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking it's only a work of art to the extent that you're collaborating with others who have worked there or people who are currently living in the city. And if that's so, then where do you like to work? Where has that dialogue between artists who are collaborating now with others who have worked there before? Where would that work well for you and why?
I think Toronto is not bad from that point of view. There is a healthy discussion here now. Whether it always results in the best answer, I don't know. I mean, I am pretty committed to London, I have to say. And there are good bits of London, and there are bad bits of London. You know, as an architect, I'd never advise you to ever work in Camden, because there are a lot of communists too, quite wealthy. But because in a way, that sort of politics excludes the open debate that you might have about a project. And that's what I don't like. Equally, I do quite a lot of work in China. And, okay, you can do stuff in China, but you can't actually engage with the locals. Because if you ask the locals, if you're trying to extract something interesting or a point of view or anything, they just say yes, which is also not useful. You need a fairly vibrant discussion. And
We just say no.
Well, no, you don't always say no. But I think the vibrant, well, hopefully intelligent, informed, imaginative discussion is what I'm talking about. And I think that has as much to do with the city as an artwork as it does with an artwork itself. Ultimately, you absorb stuff and you take it home to the privacy of your own kitchen table or studio, and then you work with it, because it doesn't exclude me, but as a work. Ultimately, I suppose it's your own individuality that gives meaning to what you discover en route. Hopefully.
Can we?
My name is Ade. I just have a quick question. You know, you look at the city, and a lot of the big projects that have happened in the city have been done by international architects. You know, you have the ROM, you have OCAD, you have even the BCE place. And I just want, Will, to maybe touch on what is it that Canadian architects need to do to start doing our own interesting buildings in the city? Because there's a lot of Canadian architects that could do these type of projects, but it seems that Canadian architects don't get the chance to do these projects.
Well, I don't believe that they don't get the chance. That's for sure. But I could turn that around and say, how many buildings in London are done by non-Londoners, non-British, or even non-Europeans? It's a lot, and I like that. If you take Battersea Power Station, which is a huge development, there's Frank Gehry doing a big bit. There's God, the guy I hate. Anyway, it doesn't matter whether I hate him or not. That's irrelevant. They're all there doing stuff, and I think that makes London a better place because it's open, and it also challenges some of the locals. And I'd hope that some of the buildings that are being built by non-Canadians or non-Torontonians here, it puts down some sort of challenge, really, and that's the way it should be. That's the way life should be like that. And because there are, no, I'm against Australia, they are very parochial. They protect their position very, very much, and I don't think that's particularly good for many of the Australian cities. It's not to say that architects aren't any good. It just needs to be more open. More of the same is less interesting than actually something that comes along and challenges the status quo.
But just if I may say, I mean, I think the idea that Canadian architects don't get to do Canadian work, or Toronto architects don't get a chance to work in this city, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, I think that they get the vast bulk of stuff. But I think the interesting thing is that the Canadian architectural maybe not aesthetic, but the philosophy behind it is more about, it's more contextual. It's more sort of as one would expect. It's more about being a good neighbor and fitting in and being observant and being part of an urban context. I mean, most Toronto architects would say that what they do is infill, because in the city all that's left at this point is infill. And I think that the role that somebody like Will Alsop or Daniel Liebeskind or Frank Gehry, and there are more, you know, the Chinese firm that did the Marilyn Monroes in Mississauga, those kinds of things. I mean, you, in a way, you know, you almost have to be from somewhere else to get away with that kind of thing. And I think that that's what's healthy for the city, is to have these voices from other places and to come and do work here.
I just find it interesting that, you know, you look at the buildings that have been done here by Canadian architects, we don't have a sharp, you know, we don't have a sharp center of design done by a Canadian architect. You know what I mean? That we don't have these buildings now by new Canadian architects. We have a lot of historical buildings that have been done by great Canadian architects, but now in the city, it's not there. You know, like we rely, you know, this is just a personal opinion. I mean, I don't know if anybody agrees with me, but you know, I'll just say that we rely now on the city, on the imports to come in and do great work. But there is great architects in Toronto. There is great architects in Canada.
Yep.
But
It's
it's like,
true.
you know, when it comes to actually getting a chance to put a building on a stilt, for example, if a Canadian architect presented that, would that have flown the same way that when Bill presented it? And I think that's an interesting discussion in Canadian architecture, period. You know. But the Opera House is not on stilts. It's a square box. No, I'm not saying Canadian architects don't do great buildings. I'm just talking about when we're talking about moving the envelope of architecture in Canada.
There's, you know, we have another question.
Chris?
Up at the very back, standing
So-
up there. Craig.
Chris, what you were just talking about actually is a good lead into my question. And it's in regards a little bit to, I suppose, what Frank Gehry was recently asked about 2 months ago by a dismissive Spanish reporter about whether his buildings were really just about spectacle. And Frank Gehry flipped him the bird rather famously. But the question maybe was really about context and how Gary's stuff doesn't really fit into an established context. And Will, your buildings also maybe transcend context. And I'm wondering if you could comment on how you approach context in a situation and the importance and how you go beyond it, essentially.
I think context is a very dangerous word. It begins with C, like cancer. And it somehow spread. You know, when I was a younger man, people didn't talk about context, but it's something that's been taught. And in a way, it's also like, you know, height has become an issue. It wasn't always an issue. And I worry about these things. It becomes a way of people who are worried, and inevitably we're dealing with change, and therefore change also engenders a sense of doubt, concern, and all those things. So, but to me, what would you fit into here? What is the context of, say, this street where we're sitting? It's terrible. Isn't it?
Okay, in North York, you're faced with broad swaths of two and three-story family homes.
You're talking rubbish, if you don't mind me saying. We're talking about the context of Yonge Street, all right?
Okay.
Which is appalling through that stretch. It's all over the place. Not that I'm trying to repair that, but you can do anything on that street. The neighborhoods, which are nice, pleasant 2- and 3-story houses, have nothing to do with the project I'm proposing there. Nothing. And yet, you know, I do object to, there is a sort of local concern about what I'm doing, which I understand that there's a concern. But at the same time, it's nothing to do with context. That's just one of those words that's always wheeled out by many groups of people, including planners. And actually, context, or that sort of argument, tends to prevent interesting stuff happening. That's what I object to. I mean, I'm old enough, I don't care anymore, you know. I mean, quite frankly, I do what I think is right, and where that right comes from, whether it's to do with the local community, what I think, what I believe. I live and breathe this stuff every day, and I worry about it, and I sit up until 1 o'clock in the morning writing about it, and you know, maybe it's all rubbish, but I tell you, it looks pretty good after a bottle of wine, but I do concern myself with it, and there's nothing more than I object to than some, I can't say that word here, coming up and talking to me about context and height. You've not considered it at all, you know. And you can say, well, look, I have considered this in the light of the golden section, which seemed to be pretty good for the Greeks and the Romans. What do you know? You want to slice a floor off this? That's a good way to ruin a building. I'm sure there are many buildings in this city and many other cities around the world which have been destroyed in terms of just pure proportion because of that sort of argument. Therefore, context, we should just ban the word. It doesn't exist.
But you know, there's more than one way of being contextual, and I think that the point is not that a building resembles those that have gone before it, because that's a mistake, and
The
that's
people
wrong.
up there seem to want that.
Well, people
No, they
think
don't know what they want,
that.
you know.
They hate change.
But hang on a second. The point that I want to make that is that this building, that, you know, which is unlike any other in Toronto, is actually a response to a very specific set of conditions. The context, in fact, of OCAD, McCall Street, Grange Park, and so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, in a sense, it's very contextual. Not that it looks like anything, and I think that there's a big difference between looking like something and responding to the conditions of the context. Craig, we have time for one last question. It's not you, Stuart. It's the person whose hand has been up for 20 minutes. Will somebody please give that woman the microphone?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Marilyn Davis. I'm alumni from OCAD and also an art director in the city. I'm young and early in my career, and I was wondering, in your career, at any one point, what was the most memorable struggle you had in the early days, and what happened that either kept you on the path to doing what you're doing today?
I missed the last bit. What happened?
Sorry, I'm emotional because I question what I do every day.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And I want to know what particular struggle sticks out most in your mind in the early days of your career, and what deterred you from not leaving your vocation and continuing on to architecture?
Well, I continue to do it because I love it, and it's as simple as that. And I like to think that most architects love what they do, because if they don't, they shouldn't do it, of course. And you can go through tough times and everything else. I'm put in mind there of your question of, I think it was Mies van der Rohe that was, he was asked what is the most important thing about architecture, and he said, get the job. Which is a pretty direct sort of answer in a way. But nonetheless, struggles, you know, I can't honestly say I've ever found it a struggle. Would I kid you? Would I? No. No, because you put that. I tell you one thing that really annoyed me, which is a sort of bit anti-Canadian, this. But we did a part of an invited competition. I'm not a great fan of competitions, but because it was invited, we did it for the Museum of Art in Edmonton. And it was a very well organized thing of going out there, giving a bit of a talk with the other competitors, there were 5 or 6, and then doing the work, going back and presenting it in front of the others, which is very unusual. I was very impressed with that. And we won, okay? We won, 100%. 100% jury vote, because Bruce Cabara, who was on the jury, told me. But we didn't get the job. You know why we didn't get the job? Because it had to be ratified by the board. This is really disappointing. Almost enough to make you give up, of course, but you don't, because the man that was going to give most of the money said, unless that guy wins, I'm not giving you the money. Hey, why have a competition? Yeah, and that was seriously, seriously wrong. And I felt, sometimes I go to bed at night and I worry about these things. I knew that we had won, and it was a good project. I think it was a brilliant project, of course, and it was good, and it might have changed Edmonton. As a result, they built the other piece of crap. And it hasn't, and Edmonton is just as shitty as it always was.
Thank you, Will.
Yay. So thank goodness.
So true. I think on that happy
So
note, let's say good night and
Yeah.
thank Will for coming.
Yeah, fabulous.
We have presents.
So,
Thank you.
Listen, just so you know, there's a fantastic exhibition up in the Great Hall, and it's really a wonderful kind of retrospective of the birth of the Sharp Center, with lots of ways the community's responded to it. So we have a little gallery there. So before you leave tonight, feel free to make your way, up the stairs and check out the exhibition. Thank you very, very much for coming, and bravo to Christopher and Will Alsop for a very entertaining, informative evening.